You really think you belong in this building looking like that? The officer's voice would later echo in a courtroom he never imagined standing in chains, because the woman he humiliated and shaved bald would turn out to be the very judge presiding over his fate. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning unfolded with a quiet, deliberate rhythm as Maya Kensington stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the cuff of her blouse with practiced precision. The fabric fell neatly against her wrist, smooth and unwrinkled, a reflection of the discipline that had defined her entire life. At 62, there was nothing fragile about her presence. Her posture remained upright, her shoulders squared, her breathing slow and controlled. She moved not with haste, but with certainty, as though every motion had been rehearsed long before the day began. On the dresser beside her lay a leather badge case, closed, unassuming, its significance hidden beneath worn edges and careful handling. Today was important, though nothing in her demeanor betrayed it. A hearing awaited, one that carried months of preparation, a case built meticulously, piece by piece, against officers who believed their authority placed them beyond consequence. Maya reached for her coat, a modest charcoal piece that neither drew attention nor invited scrutiny, and slipped it on with the same calm efficiency. Outside, the city stirred to life under a pale wash of early sunlight. Chicago's downtown streets carried the familiar hum of commuters, the distant rumble of buses, the muted conversations of strangers crossing paths without acknowledgement. Maya stepped into that current without disruption, blending seamlessly into the flow. To anyone watching, she was simply another older black woman heading into a government building. Unremarkable, quiet, easy to overlook. Yet her eyes missed nothing. Reflections in glass storefronts, the spacing between footsteps behind her, the subtle tightening of expressions as she passed certain corners. These details registered effortlessly, not as threats, but as information. Years within a system that often tested her patience had refined that awareness into something instinctive. When the courthouse came into view, its stone columns rising with cold authority against the morning sky, Maya paused just briefly at the base of the steps. Not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. This building, with all its weight and symbolism, had been both a battlefield and a responsibility for most of her career. She ascended the steps steadily, heels striking the concrete with a measured cadence that echoed faintly against the facade. Inside, the air shifted, cooler, sharper, carrying the sterile scent of polished floors and controlled order. Lines formed at the security checkpoint, people shuffling forward, adjusting bags, preparing to be inspected. Maya joined them without announcement, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression neutral. Conversations hummed softly around her, fragments of legal jargon and morning complaints blending into a low, constant murmur. She stood patiently, waiting her turn, another face in a line of faces. No one recognized her. No one looked twice. And in that anonymity, the stage was quietly set for a mistake that would ripple far beyond this ordinary morning. The line inched forward with the slow impatience of bureaucracy, each person stepping through the metal detector under the watchful gaze of Deputy Wallace, whose posture carried the stiff authority of someone who had long mistaken routine for power. When Maya reached the front, she placed her leather bag on the conveyor belt without hesitation, her movements deliberate, her expression composed. Wallace's eyes narrowed the moment they landed on her, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, as if something about her presence irritated him in a way he could not quite explain. "Step forward," he said, his tone clipped, already sharper than it had been with the others before her. Maya complied, walking through the detector. The machine beeped, a short, mechanical chirp that drew Wallace's full attention. His lips curled faintly, not in concern, but in something closer to satisfaction. "Of course," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Step aside." Maya paused, her gaze steady. "It's likely the underwire," she said calmly, her voice even measured. "It triggers sometimes. Wallace did not respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as though searching for confirmation of a suspicion he had already decided was true. Behind her, the line shifted uncomfortably, people exchanging glances, the subtle pressure of impatience building. "I said step aside," Wallace repeated, louder this time, his hand gesturing toward the secondary screening area with a sharp flick of his wrist. Maya stepped to the side without protest, folding her hands loosely in front of her. Her breathing remained slow, controlled, but her eyes sharpened, observing every detail. The way Wallace's fingers drummed against the table, the slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the way he made no effort to move the line along until she complied fully. A younger clerk nearby hesitated, glancing at Maya with a flicker of recognition, but Wallace's presence seemed to silence any thought of intervention. Wallace approached her, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "Arms out," he instructed, already reaching for the handheld scanner before she could respond. Maya raised her arms slightly, maintaining her composure as he moved the device over her body with exaggerated thoroughness. The scanner passed once, then again, slower the second time, as if you were hoping to find something the first sweep had missed. "Bag," he said abruptly, nodding toward the conveyor belt where her purse sat waiting. "Open it." Maya turned her head slightly, her gaze flicking to the bag, then back to him. "If you allow me, I can retrieve my identification," she said, her tone still respectful, still controlled. Wallace let out a short, dismissive breath. "I didn't ask for an explanation. I said open the bag." There was a shift now, subtle but undeniable. The people nearby began to watch more openly, their curiosity overtaking their discomfort. Maya stepped toward the table, unzipping the bag slowly, carefully, as if each movement were being catalogued, which in a sense it was. Wallace leaned in slightly, his presence crowding the space, his voice dropping just enough to carry a sharper edge. "You people always got something to hide," he muttered, just beneath the threshold of plausible deniability. Maya's hands paused for the briefest moment inside the bag, not from hesitation, but from the weight of the words. Then, just as smoothly, she continued, her fingers brushing against the contents, locating the badge case without revealing it yet. Her eyes lifted, meeting his directly, calm but unyielding. Wallace held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, his expression hardening, as if her composure itself was an act of defiance. And in that moment, something shifted in him. Not caution, not professionalism, but irritation, the kind that demanded escalation rather than resolution. He straightened, turning his head slightly toward the hallway behind him. "Donnelly," he called out, his voice carrying across the checkpoint. "I think we got a situation here." Footsteps answered Wallace's call. Almost immediately, heavy and unhurried, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of authority that had never been questioned. Officer Rick Donnelly emerged from the hallway with Officer Brent Carnes close behind, both men scanning the scene with practiced detachment that quickly sharpened into interest as their attention settled on Maya. Donnelly's expression shifted first, his lips pressing into a thin line that curved into something resembling a smirk. "What's the issue?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided there was one. Wallace gestured toward Maya with a tilt of his chin. She tripped the detector. "Acting cagey. Won't cooperate." Maya's gaze moved from one officer to the other, steady, observant, her posture unchanged. "I've been fully cooperative," she said evenly. "I offered to present identification." Donnelly let out a quiet breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough to carry mockery. He stepped forward, closing the distance with a deliberate slowness that felt less like procedure and more like intimidation. "Identification," he repeated, as if testing the word. Funny how that's always the first thing people say when they get caught up in something they shouldn't be in. Carnes circled slightly to Maya's side, positioning himself just far enough to block any easy movement without making it obvious. His eyes moved over her with clinical detachment, assessing, measuring, already reducing her to a problem to be handled. Maya remained still, her hands visible, her voice calm. If you allow me to retrieve it, this can be resolved quickly. Donnelly's jaw tightened, his head tilting just a fraction as he studied her face. There was something about her composure that unsettled him, though he would not have admitted it even to himself. It was not fear he saw there, not confusion, but something quieter, firmer, and that absence of submission irritated him more than open defiance ever could. "No," he said flatly. "You don't get to control how this goes." The words landed with weight, not because they were loud, but because of the certainty behind them. The surrounding area had grown quieter now, the earlier hum of conversation fading into a tense stillness as more people began to watch openly. A security camera angled above captured everything, its red light blinking steadily, indifferent to the shift in atmosphere below. Maya's fingers rested lightly against the edge of her bag, but she made no move to open the badge case hidden inside. Instead, she met Donnelly's gaze directly. "Officer, I am asking you to follow proper procedure." The request was simple, measured, but it landed like a challenge. Donnelly's expression hardened instantly, his shoulders squaring as if bracing against an insult. "Proper procedure," he echoed, his voice dropping lower, edged with something sharper now. "You think you get to lecture me on procedure?" Carnes let out a low exhale, stepping closer, his presence tightening the space around her. "We've seen this before," he said, his tone smooth but cold. "People come in here thinking they can say the right words, act calm, and it makes them untouchable." Maya did not respond immediately. Her silence stretched just long enough to expose the tension beneath their words, to let their assumptions fill the space without interruption. When she did speak, her voice remained steady. "I'm not trying to be untouchable. I'm asking to be treated lawfully." For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in the air, subtle and fleeting, like a crack that might have widened under different circumstances. But Donnelly stepped forward again, closing that gap with force, his hand reaching toward her wrist without warning. "We're done asking," he said, his grip firm, fingers tightening just enough to assert control. "You're coming with us." The moment Donnelly's hand closed around Maya's wrist, the shift from authority to force became unmistakable. His grip was firm, deliberate, designed not just to control, but to display control. Maya did not pull away. She did not resist. Instead, she allowed the movement, her body adjusting with quiet balance as he turned her slightly toward the hallway. "There's no need for this," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the nearby crowd. "You are escalating a situation without cause. You lost the right to tell us anything." Donnelly snapped, tightening his hold as if her calm tone itself demanded correction. Carnes moved in on her other side, his presence closing off any sense of space. "Hands behind your back," he ordered, already reaching for her other arm. Maya's eyes flicked briefly toward the security cameras above, then back to the officers. "I am not resisting," she said clearly. "You are making a mistake." "Yeah," Carnes replied under his breath, his fingers pressing against her arm as he guided it backward with controlled force. "We hear that all the time." The motion was precise, practiced, stripping away dignity under the guise of procedure. Maya's shoulders remained squared even as her arms were pulled behind her, her posture refusing to collapse under the pressure. Around them, the tension thickened. A man near the front of the line shifted his weight uneasily, his phone halfway raised before he thought better of it. A woman whispered something to the person beside her, her voice barely audible but sharp with discomfort. Still, no one stepped forward. The quiet compliance of the crowd hung heavier than any shouted command. Donnelly reached to his belt, pulling free a pair of handcuffs. The metal glinted under the courthouse lights as he positioned them with a casual familiarity that spoke of routine. "Last chance," he said, though there was no real offer in his tone. "Stop making this harder than it needs to be." Maya did not answer immediately. Her breathing remained even, her gaze fixed ahead rather than on the officers restraining her. When she did speak, her voice carried a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with their aggression. "Everything you're doing is being recorded. For a fraction of a second, Donnelly's expression flickered, but it hardened just as quickly, irritation overriding caution. "Good," he said, snapping one cuff into place around her wrist. The sound was sharp, final. "Then there won't be any confusion about how this went down." Karn secured the other cuff, pulling her wrist together with more force than necessary. The movement abrupt, almost punitive. Maya's body absorbed the motion without protest, her balance holding steady despite the sudden pull. "Walk," Donnelly ordered, guiding her forward with a firm push at her arm. Maya moved, her steps measured despite the constraint, her head held level. Each footfall echoed faintly against the polished floor, a steady rhythm that cut through the murmurs surrounding them. They led her away from the checkpoint, past rows of silent observers, through a side corridor where the light dimmed and the noise of the main hall faded into a distant hum. The further they went, the more the environment changed, less public, more controlled, a space where oversight felt thinner, where actions carried fewer immediate witnesses. Carnes glanced at Donnelly, a brief exchange passing between them, without words. Something settled, something decided. Maya noticed. She noticed everything. And still, she said nothing more. As they pushed open the heavy door at the end of the corridor and guided her inside. The door closed behind them with a dull, final thud, sealing off the noise of the courthouse and replacing it with a heavy, controlled silence. The room was small, windowless, its fluorescent lights casting a pale, unforgiving glow over metal cabinets and a single reinforced chair bolted to the floor. Donnelly guided Maya forward with a firm push between her shoulder blades, enough to assert dominance without appearing excessive. "Sit," he ordered. Maya complied without hesitation, lowering herself into the chair with measured precision, her cuffed hands resting behind her, her posture still upright despite the constraint. Carnes moved to the side, crossing his arms as he studied her, his expression carrying a quiet calculation that had already dismissed her as manageable. Donnelly paced once, slow and deliberate, as if considering how far he wanted to take this. Then he stopped in front of her, tilting his head slightly. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice low, edged with irritation. "You walk in here like you're above everything, like none of this applies to you." Maya lifted her gaze to meet his calm, unwavering. "I walked in here expecting to be treated according to the law," she replied. The answer did not raise her volume, but it struck something in him. Donnelly's jaw tightened, a faint pulse visible near his temple. Carnes let out a quiet breath, glancing toward the corner of the room where a small counter held miscellaneous items, confiscated belongings, tools, things used for processing detainees. "Maybe she needs a reminder," Carnes said, his tone smooth, almost casual, but carrying an undercurrent that shifted the atmosphere instantly. Donnelly followed his gaze, then nodded once, the decision settling quickly. "Yeah," he said, "let's fix that attitude." Maya's eyes tracked the movement as Carnes stepped toward the counter and reached for a small electric clipper, the kind used for basic processing, its cord coiled loosely beside it. The device hummed faintly as he tested it, the sound filling the room with a mechanical buzz that felt louder than it should have. Maya did not move. Her breathing remained steady, her shoulders squared, her gaze returning to Donnelly. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You are crossing a line you cannot uncross." Donnelly leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to hers, his expression hard, almost daring. "That line," he said quietly. "We decide where that line is." Carnes stepped behind her, the hum of the clippers growing louder as he brought them closer. The first pass was abrupt, the vibration traveling through her scalp as a strip of hair fell away, drifting down to the cold floor below. The sound of it landing, soft, almost weightless, stood in stark contrast to the heaviness of the act itself. Maya's fingers tightened slightly against each other behind her back, the only visible sign of tension, but her face remained composed, her eyes forward, unbroken. Carnes continued, methodical, each movement deliberate, reducing what they saw as defiance into something they believed resembled control. Strands fell in uneven patterns, collecting at her feet, marking the passage of each second. Donnelly watched closely, arms folded now, a faint satisfaction settling into his posture as if the act itself validated his authority. "There," he said after a moment, straightening. "Maybe now you'll remember where you are." The clippers powered down with a soft click, the sudden silence pressing in around them. Maya sat still for a beat, then slowly lifted her chin, her gaze steady as it returned to Donnelly. There was no fear in her expression, no pleading, only a quiet, unwavering resolve that did not match the situation they had forced upon her. And for the briefest moment, something in that look unsettled him, though he would never admit it. The silence that followed lingered longer than expected, thick and unmoving, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would come next. Donnelly exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he stepped back, the earlier tension settling into something colder, more procedural. "All right," he said, his tone shifting into that familiar cadence of authority wrapping itself in justification. "We're done playing games." He turned slightly toward the metal table, pulling a notepad closer, flipping it open with a sharp motion. Disorderly conduct, failure to comply, suspicious behavior inside a government facility. Each charge was spoken as if it were already fact, already sealed. Carnes leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Maya with a faint, satisfied look, as though the situation had resolved exactly as expected. "Sign it," Donnelly added, glancing back at her. "Or don't. Either way, this goes on record." Maya did not respond immediately. She sat there, hands still secured behind her, head held level despite the uneven remains of her hair, her presence unchanged in a way that felt almost unnatural given what had just been done to her. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space between them. Then, slowly she spoke. "Officer Donnelly," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying a weight that did not match her restrained position. He paused, pen hovering above the paper, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "What?" he replied, irritation creeping back into his tone. Maya's gaze met his directly, unflinching. "There's still a moment here," she continued, each word deliberate, measured. "A moment where you can stop, where you can reconsider everything you have done in this room." Carnes let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head as he shifted his weight. Donnelly's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience thinning. "You don't get to give me advice," he said flatly. But Maya did not look away. "You are not just writing a report," she said. "You are documenting your own decisions. Every action, every choice. And once that record is complete, it will not belong to you anymore." The words hung in the air, subtle but precise, carrying an implication that reached further than the room they stood in. Donnelly stared at her for a second longer, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a dismissive edge. He let out a short, humorless breath. "You think you're scaring me with that?" he said, leaning back slightly, pen tapping once against the paper. "I've been doing this job long enough to know exactly how this plays out." Carnes chuckled under his breath. "They always talk like that," he added, "like there's some big consequence waiting around the corner." Maya's expression did not change. "There is," she said simply. Donnelly shook his head, a faint grin pulling at the corner of his mouth now, not from amusement, but from the certainty of someone who had never been forced to question his own authority. He scribbled something onto the form, the sound of the pen dragging across paper sharp in the quiet room. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice firm, final. "You're going to sign this. You're going to walk out of here with a warning if you're lucky. And you're going to remember, not to cause problems where you don't belong." He set the pen down with a decisive tap, then stepped closer, just enough to loom over her again. "Because out there," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the courthouse beyond the walls, "people like you don't get the benefit of the doubt." Maya held his gaze, her calm unwavering, her silence now heavier than any argument. And in that silence, the last opportunity for him to step back, to correct course, slipped away completely, discarded by his own hand without a second thought. Maya held his gaze for one final second, then slowly exhaled, the sound barely audible, yet somehow commanding the entire room's attention. "Then we are done here," she said quietly. Donnelly frowned, the words not landing the way he expected. "Yeah," he replied, irritation creeping back in. "We are." But Maya had already shifted her focus past him, toward the door. "Officer," she called, her voice no longer directed at Donnelly or Carnes, but beyond them, steady and precise. There was a brief pause, then the door opened. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but with controlled urgency. Two suited individuals stepped inside, followed by a uniformed court clerk whose face had gone pale the moment her eyes landed on Maya. "Ma'am," the clerk began, her voice tight, almost breathless. Donnelly turned, confusion flashing across his face. "What is this?" he demanded, stepping slightly forward as if to block them. One of the suited men, tall, composed, moved just enough to meet his line of sight. "You need to step aside, officer." The tone was not loud, but it carried weight, authority that did not need to be asserted twice. Carnes straightened off the wall, his posture shifting, uncertainty creeping into his stance. "This is an active detainment," he said, though his voice lacked the earlier certainty. The second suited official stepped forward, eyes fixed on Maya, not the officers. "Judge Kensington," he said, his voice respectful, measured. "We've been trying to locate you. The courtroom is waiting." The words did not echo, but they landed with the force of something irreversible. Donnelly froze. The name seemed to hang in the air, refusing to settle. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. The clerk stepped fully into the room, clutching a folder tightly against her chest. "That is Judge Maya Kensington," she said, each word clear, undeniable. "Presiding judge over the internal misconduct hearing scheduled this morning." Silence followed, but it was no longer empty. It was suffocating. Donnelly's eyes shifted slowly back to Maya, really looking at her now, for the first time, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with something his mind refused to accept. His gaze flicked to her posture, her composure, the quiet authority that had never wavered, then to the chair, the restraints, the floor scattered with what they had taken from her. His throat tightened. "No," he muttered under his breath, not in denial, but in disbelief. Carnes took a small step back, his hands no longer crossed, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides, as if he had forgotten what to do with them. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing inward as realization took hold. Maya did not move immediately. She simply sat there, meeting Donnelly's gaze with the same calm she had held from the beginning. But now that calm carried context, weight, consequence. "Remove the cuffs," one of the suited officials said firmly. Donnelly hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to reveal everything. His hand moved slowly toward his belt, fingers fumbling slightly as he reached for the key. The same hands that had acted without hesitation moments ago now struggled with the simplest motion. The click that followed was softer than before, but far heavier. Maya brought her hands forward, rubbing her wrists once, not out of discomfort, but as if resetting herself. Then, with measured grace, she stood. Even now, even like this, her presence filled the room completely. No raised voice, no anger, just certainty. Donnelly's breathing had changed, shorter, uneven, each inhale catching slightly as the reality settled in. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The confidence, the control, the certainty he had worn like armor only moments ago had vanished, leaving something hollow in its place. And for the first time since this began, he understood exactly what Maya had meant when she said there would be consequences. The room did not move, but everything inside it had shifted. Donnelly stood frozen, his hands still hovering near his belt, as if the motion of unlocking the cuffs had drained something essential from him. The suited official stepped forward, his tone no longer measured, but firm with unmistakable authority. "Officer Rick, Donnelly, you are to step away immediately." This time, there was no hesitation in the command, only expectation. Donnelly complied, but not with confidence. His steps were slow, uneven, as if the ground beneath him had changed without warning. Carnes followed, retreating toward the wall, his earlier composure gone, replaced by a rigid stillness that bordered on panic. Maya adjusted her sleeves with quiet precision, her movements controlled, unhurried, as though reclaiming not just her composure, but the entire space itself. The court clerk stepped closer, her voice respectful, almost apologetic. "Your Honor, the courtroom is ready." Maya gave a small nod, then turned her gaze back to Donnelly and Carnes. It was not anger that filled her expression. It was something far heavier, clarity. "You will both remain available," she said, her voice even, carrying the weight of finality. "Do not leave this building." Neither man responded. They could not. The authority in her tone left no room for interpretation, no space for defiance. Moments later, the hallway outside felt different as Maya stepped back into it, flanked now not by force, but by respect. Heads turned, whispers spread, and those who had watched earlier now understood what they had witnessed. Donnelly and Carnes followed at a distance, not by choice, but because they had nowhere else to go. The courtroom doors opened with a low creak, revealing a space already filled. Attorneys seated, observers lining the benches, the quiet tension of anticipation hanging in the air. Conversations died instantly as Maya entered. Even in her altered state, even with the visible evidence of what had been done to her, her presence commanded the room. She moved toward the bench with steady steps, each one deliberate, each one echoing faintly against the polished floor. The bailiff's voice rang out, clear and formal. "All rise." The room obeyed. Maya took her seat, the robe draped over her shoulders, the symbol of authority settling in a place with quiet inevitability. She looked out across the courtroom, her gaze passing over every face until it reached the two men standing near the back. Donnelly could not hold her eyes for long. Carnes stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow. "Be seated," Maya said. The courtroom complied, the sound of chairs moving filling the space before silence returned. She opened the file in front of her, its contents already familiar, already decided. "We are here today to review allegations of misconduct," she began, her voice steady, each word precise. "Abuse of authority, unlawful detention, conduct unbecoming of sworn officers." Each charge landed heavier than the last. Donnelly swallowed hard, his hands now clasped tightly in front of him, the confidence that had once defined him completely gone. Carnes shifted slightly, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance uncertain. Maya paused briefly, her gaze lifting once more to meet theirs. "The court will also take into account events that occurred within this building earlier this morning." A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Every eye turned toward the two officers. There was no escape from it now. No explanation that could undo what had been done. No authority left to shield them. Only the full weight of consequence unfolding in the very place they had once believed they controlled. The courtroom remained still long after the final words had been spoken, as if no one wanted to disturb the weight of what had just unfolded. Maya Kensington closed the file in front of her with a quiet, deliberate motion, the soft sound echoing far louder than it should have in the silence. "This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with immediate disciplinary action and criminal referral," she stated, her voice unwavering, each syllable precise. "Effective immediately, Officer Rick Donnelly and Officer Brent Carnes are relieved of duty. Their badges are revoked pending full investigation, and both are to be remanded for further legal proceedings." There was no rise in her tone, no dramatic pause, just clarity, final and immovable. Two uniformed officers stepped forward from the side of the courtroom, their presence firm but controlled, a mirror of the authority that had once been abused. Donnelly did not resist as they approached, but his posture had collapsed inward, his shoulders no longer squared, his gaze fixed somewhere on the floor, as if searching for something he had already lost. Carnes stood rigid for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, the last trace of defiance leaving him as his hands were guided behind his back. The same procedure, the same control. Only now it belonged to someone else. The faint sound of restraint being secured carried across the room. Not sharp, not loud, but unmistakable. Maya watched without expression, her hands resting calmly on the bench, her presence steady as the two men were turned and led away. No one spoke. No one needed to. The consequence spoke for itself. As the doors closed behind them, the tension that had gripped the room began to ease, replaced by something quieter, steadier, something closer to balance being restored. Maya remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze sweeping once across the courtroom, not to assert dominance, but to acknowledge what had just been set right. Then she rose. The movement was simple, unhurried, but it carried with it the full weight of resolution. The bailiff called out once more, "All rise," and again, the room responded without hesitation. This time, the respect was different. It was not routine. It was earned, undeniable. Maya stepped down from the bench, the robe settling around her as she moved, her pace measured, her posture unchanged despite everything that had been done to her just hours before. As she passed through the aisle, people shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. A quiet path opened before her, not forced, not commanded, given. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled. The same hallways, the same polished floors, the same distant echoes of footsteps. But now, the tension that had lingered earlier had been replaced with something steadier, something just. Maya walked forward, her reflection briefly catching in the glass panels along the corridor. For a moment, she paused, not to dwell, not to linger, but to simply stand in that stillness. Her hand lifted, smoothing the edge of her sleeve, a small, familiar gesture that brought everything back into alignment. Then, without hesitation, she continued on. The courthouse doors opened ahead, sunlight spilling in, warm and steady, stretching across the floor at her feet. She stepped into it with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. No announcement, no spectacle, just a woman returning to her work, her purpose intact, her dignity untouched. Behind her, the system moved forward, corrected, reminded, held accountable. And in that quiet continuation, justice did not need to declare itself. It simply endured.